January 1945. North Atlantic. The sea is black iron under a low frozen sky. Spray drives across the bow of a Royal Navy escort, freezing where it lands, turning the guardrails into bars of glass. Inside the operations room, the only light comes from the soft green glow of a radar screen and the dim red bulbs above it. For hours, the operator has watched a single stubborn trace, a U-boat running shallow, stalking the convoy. The contact comes and goes with the heave of the sea, but it is there, a small spike of energy against the clutter of rain and waves. Then, without warning, it fades. He adjusts the gain, checks the bearings, taps the side of the set with a gloved knuckle. Nothing. The sea clutter remains. The horizon echoes remain, but the sharp little tooth of the enemy has gone. Above him, men strain their eyes into the night. Lookouts search for a periscope feather or the thin shadow of a conning tower. There is nothing to see. Somewhere out there, a submarine has, to all appearances, vanished. In London and in a handful of coastal laboratories, British engineers are already asking the same question as the men at sea. How do you fight an enemy that has learned to slip through your radar, and what kind of mind comes up with a trick like that? By the outbreak of the Second World War in September 1939, Britain had already taken a decisive, if largely invisible, lead in one of the conflict's most critical technologies, radar. Since the mid-1930s, teams at the Air Ministry, working under the guidance of Sir Henry Tizard and overseeing the experimental stations at Bordsey and later Orfordness, had refined a new method of early warning by measuring reflections of radio waves. The system, codenamed Chain Home, was operational before hostilities began. It provided the RAF with unprecedented reach, allowing controllers to plot incoming aircraft long before they crossed the coast. At sea, however, the picture remained less developed. The Royal Navy had long relied on lookouts, signal lamps and hydrophones, but by 1941, radar sets began entering service aboard destroyers and escorts. These were crude by later standards, short wavelength sets with limited discrimination against sea clutter, requiring skilled interpretation. Yet in the blackness of the Atlantic, they offered a transformational advantage over enemy forces operating in the dark. By mid-1942, Britain had transferred much radar research to the telecommunications research establishment Trey in Malvern, solidifying its position at the heart of Allied scientific war work. The Royal Navy's Admiralty Signal Establishment ASP, based partly in Haslemere and later relocated for safety, began adapting land-based radar principles into seaborne application. The challenges were specific. A naval set had to operate in salt air, withstand the roll of a ship and penetrate radar interference from waves. Gradually, the sets improved, allowing escorts to detect a surfaced U-boat at several miles distance, even in fog or moonless waters. German submarine commanders, accustomed to operating largely unseen, soon realized this new vulnerability. Until 1942, a typical U-boat attack pattern relied on shadowing a convoy, surfacing at night, and maneuvering into attack position using the cover of darkness alone. The arrival of effective maritime radar drastically curtailed this method. By late 1943, U-boat losses began to rise. British and Canadian escorts, many fitted with centimetric radar sets powered by the cavity magnetron itself, a British engineering breakthrough of 1940, could now detect even small conning towers with alarming precision. Aircraft equipped with radar patrolled previously safe ocean gaps. The hunter had, for a time, become the hunted. Across Germany, efforts were immediately made to adapt. The snorkel, originally a Dutch invention, became standardized across the U-boat fleet by 1944. It allowed submarines to operate diesel engines just below the surface, extending underwater endurance and reducing exposure. But its adoption brought new challenges. The snorkel's thin mast, breaking the surface of the sea, was a fragile point of radar reflection. British and American patrol aircraft frequently homed in on these slender returns, sometimes moments before anti-submarine weapons were deployed. Engineers and officers on both sides recognized that visibility to radar was no longer purely a matter of size or shape. It was also influenced by the material qualities of an object. The Germans began experimenting with coatings, dark tar-like materials applied first to snorkels and later to specific parts of the conning tower. These were recorded under codenames such as Sumpf and Schornsteinfehr, alluding to their thick, soot-like appearance. Early reports from boarded or captured equipment suggested a measurable reduction in the radar cross-section. Whether the reduction was sufficient to nullify detection remained debated at the time, but it was enough to cause intermittent tracking and confusion during operations in poor weather. British officers at sea responded as they did to most technical surprises by meticulously observing, reporting and adapting. In the laboratories and analysis units ashore, engineers sought ways to counter these efforts. They conducted shore-based radar tests on representative targets, experimenting with power settings, wavelength adjustments, and improved cross-system detection methods. By late 1944, such work was no longer considered marginal. It was acknowledged as an essential component of the broader campaign. Thus, when a radar operator in the cold North Atlantic saw a contact fade inexplicably into nothing, He was unwittingly witnessing one of the quiet frontiers of modern warfare, the battle between detection and concealment, fought not only with steel and gunpowder, but with radio waves, mathematics, and, occasionally, something that resembled oil. Behind every improvement in detection at sea stood a quiet network of laboratories, naval research units, and specialist intelligence sections. Chief among them was the Admiralty Signal Establishment ASICS, responsible for naval communications and radar development. Its staff consisted of physicists, electronics specialists, naval officers, and technicians. During the war, many were housed in hastily adapted facilities, relocated inland to avoid bombing. Their surroundings often far removed from the salt air and rolling decks. Their work ultimately served. Working in close conjunction with the telecommunications research establishment TRE at Malvern, the ACE adapted technical theory to maritime reality, TRE, known for pioneering airborne radar, provided foundational research into signal behavior, wave physics, and electronic countermeasures. The ACE handled practical application, antenna designed for ships, signal clarity in rough seas, waveform calculations to distinguish a periscope or snorkel mast from the general clutter. Though neither organization received much public attention at the time, their combined efforts brought Allied navies from basic experimentation to calibrated operational capability within a few short years. Parallel to this was the growing influence of scientific intelligence. The Air Ministry's Section 8, under Dr. R.V. Jones, demonstrated how insights drawn from fragments of enemy equipment could reveal entire fields of technological strategy. Though Jones's primary focus lay in enemy radio navigation and missile guidance, the ethos of his team examining the smallest anomalies for strategic significance influenced Admiralty thinking. Captured components from submarines recovered or salvaged during 1944 were dispatched to specialized testing facilities. Blackened coatings taken from snorkel masts were analyzed for conductive and absorptive properties. Laboratory reports, often labeled confidential or most secret, indicated that at specific frequencies, the material could reduce radar returns by measurable percentages. While not foolproof, such materials complicated detection enough to demand compensatory countermeasures. The broader strategic situation amplified the value of this work. By early 1944, the Allies were preparing for Operation Overlord. Unrestricted U-boat activity in the English Channel or approaches to the southern coast of Britain could jeopardize the invasion fleet. Controlling the sea lanes was not merely an operational necessity but a precondition for the liberation of Europe. The Admiralty, recalling lessons from the height of the Battle of the Atlantic, now placed renewed emphasis on integrating radar with other systems, high-frequency direction finding HFDF, sonar, ASDIC aerial reconnaissance, and naval intelligence. A submarine might evade a radar pulse through clever engineering, but it could still betray its position through radio traffic, acoustic signature, or a fleeting surface disturbance. The role of industry supported these advances. British firms such as Marconi, AC Cossa, and EMI produced radar sets in quantity, incorporating feedback from test ranges and combat reports. The cavity magnetron, whose refinement at Birmingham University in 1940 by John Randall and Harry Boot enabled centimetric radar, remained central to the effort. Its output frequency offered finer resolution, making small metallic protrusions on a submarine more detectable, even in heavy sea conditions. When the Germans adjusted materials to reduce their radar signature, British scientists responded through frequency variation, improved amplification, and waveform refinement. Personalities occasionally surfaced in correspondence, though most remained anonymous. Senior naval officers noted the ingenuity of civilian engineers, many of whom had never served at sea yet understood its dangers intimately through countless hours of feedback and analysis. Young men and women recently graduated from universities, alongside technicians trained through accelerated wartime schemes, contributed to incremental improvements in equipment that collectively shifted the balance of maritime warfare. In official communications, this was seldom framed as brilliance. Rather, it was described as methodical progress under adverse conditions. By the final year of the war, the Admiralty no longer regarded such work as peripheral. The concept that an enemy could alter physical properties, whether through shape, structure, or coating, to degrade radar detection had taken firm hold. To counter it, the British developed supplementary techniques. Radar sets were recalibrated, operators trained to recognize incomplete returns, and detection was treated as a multi-layered process rather than a single instrument reading. Reports from late 1944 onward reflect a rising confidence that, while certain tricks could cause momentary disappearance, the overall surveillance network was resilient. What vanished briefly from seaborne radar might still be traced via airborne patrols or located acoustically. Thus, by the beginning of 1945, Britain approached maritime warfare with the accumulated power of engineering, intelligence, and tactical adaptation. The challenge posed by stealth materials, including those that resembled nothing more advanced than a dark viscous coating, had been answered not by any single countermeasure, but by collective resilience. And it was precisely this mindset of refinement through persistence that allowed British engineers to confront what some Observers called a crazy trick, and to do so with calm determination. The men who operated radar at sea rarely thought of themselves as pioneers. Their task was practical: to read a signal, interpret its meaning, and pass the information to the bridge. Yet the emergence of intermittent traces brought a psychological strain unlike anything they had trained for. Many operators were in their late teens or early 20s. They worked long hours in subdued lighting, eyes fixed on the cathode tube, where the difference between safety and disaster could appear as a faint peak among noise. When a target vanished, the instinctive response was self-doubt. Was the gain set correctly? Had the sea state altered interpretation? Was it equipment malfunction, atmospheric disturbance, or had the enemy simply sunk beneath the surface? The operator's report had to be both rapid and measured. Any hesitation could cost minutes. In heavy seas, escorts maneuvering in formation depended on those signals to launch attacks or take evasive action. Eyewitness accounts occasionally refer to radar screens going quiet for brief seconds that felt considerably longer. The tension was amplified by the knowledge that somewhere in the darkness, the submarine's commander was benefiting from the gap. Yet throughout, British operators remained composed. They did not cease watching. They adjusted the gain fractionally, swept the sector again, and continued listening through the crackle of headphones. Calm persistence, cultivated through discipline, proved as effective as any countermeasure. When detection became uncertain, attention replaced clarity. And ultimately, it was that sustained vigilance which ensured a vanished trace did not become a vanished ship. Radar detection at sea depended on the reflection of radio waves. When a pulse struck a solid surface, part of it returned to the source, where it was interpreted as a point of contact. The size of the return its radar cross-section was influenced not only by the object's dimensions but also by its shape, orientation, and surface properties. A mast, or periscope, though small, produced a distinctive response if it projected cleanly above the water. But if materials were designed to absorb or scatter incident energy, the amplitude of the return could be markedly reduced. British radar operated at wavelengths, which varied according to the set installed. Early systems used meter-band signals, later refined to descent frequency with the introduction of the cavity magnetron centimetric wavelengths. The shorter wavelength allowed detection of smaller objects, but also required precise alignment and was susceptible to surface clutter. Sea waves, particularly under storm conditions, could generate reflections that obscured or distorted signals. Enemy engineers, aware of these limitations, experimented with coatings that altered the dielectric and conductive properties of exposed structures. When applied to snorkels or metallic fittings, such coatings diminished echo strength. They did not render the submarine invisible but weakened its profile against the background interference. Detection shifted from straightforward clarity to interpretive skill. British engineers countered this by adjusting frequency, increasing pulse power, and combining radar with other sensors. Theory was translated directly into practice. Radar displays were refined, scanning patterns widened, and operators trained to recognize transient spikes even when not cleanly defined. The technical conflict was not over invention versus invention, but calibration versus concealment, an iterative contest where understanding the physics outweighed the allure of the dramatic trick. Camouflage at sea had long been a matter of paint schemes and geometry. During the First World War, British artists, naval designers, and engineers collaborated on dazzle patterns, bold, angular designs intended to disrupt visual rangefinding. By the Second World War, such patterns had evolved into more subdued tones, influenced by operational environments and atmospheric conditions. Yet radar, indifferent to color or shape, demanded an entirely new approach. Enemy experimentation with radar reflective modification emerged as a logical extension of camouflage. Instead of deceiving the human eye, the objective was to distort electronic perception. Coatings appeared crude, tar-like substances that adhered to metal surfaces and gave them a dull, non-reflective finish. To some, these substances seemed improvisational, more maintenance issue than technological asset. But in laboratory conditions, when radar pulses were directed at coated and uncoated samples, the difference in return strength, though modest, was measurable. The British response contained no single dramatic stroke. Rather than adopting a matching concealment material, they integrated detection methods. Radar anomalies were cross-referenced with acoustic signals from sonar and positional data from HFDF. If a contact vanished, ships maintained course and depth charges were sometimes dropped regardless, on the assumption that concealment might not imply absence. Thus, camouflage entered a new phase. It was no longer limited to pattern and pigment, but extended into the realm of electromagnetic interaction. The war at sea had become, in part, a fight over what could be seen, not by the eye, but by the machine. The struggle against concealment was not won on the bridge of a destroyer, but in controlled conditions, miles inland. When U-boats were sunk or captured, fragments of their structure, snorkel heads, antenna mounts, coated plates were quietly shipped to secure analysis sites. Naval engineers, working alongside physicists, subjected these materials to repeated radar exposure using apparatus similar to that installed at sea. The results confirmed what operators had suspected. Reflective strength was reduced, not eliminated, not masked entirely, but weakened enough to complicate rapid detection. Scientific intelligence, already proven decisive in air defense and countering German beam navigation systems, now shaped maritime tactics. Reports synthesized laboratory findings with operational accounts, establishing patterns. If a contact appeared briefly and then vanished, it might not be due to submergence alone. It could signal the presence of radar-interfering coating or structural adaptation. Detection, therefore, needed to be persistent rather than conclusive. Such reports rarely featured names. Instead, acceptances were phrased as recommended modifications or preliminary agreement. Yet behind each recommendation lay analytical clarity and intellectual acuity. The war at sea was fought not only with depth charges, but with the patient interpretation of traces both on radar screens and in laboratory results. What seemed a practical anomaly became a strategic data point. By late 1944, intelligence analysts no longer viewed concealment materials as curiosity. They were recognized as credible threats, and their existence validated the British conviction that technological superiority must be continuously maintained, not simply achieved. The willingness to support unconventional research defined much of Britain's wartime engineering success. Churchill himself, though a traditional naval advocate, maintained a keen interest in scientific development. His support for radar deployment in 1939, his sponsorship of the TISAD mission in 1940, and his encouragement of lateral thinking within specialist departments reflected a broader philosophy that no idea, however unusual, should be rejected without examination. Within the Admiralty, similar pragmatism prevailed. Proposed modifications to radar, even those that appeared marginal or technically obscure, were allocated trial resources. Engineers were not expected to argue for brilliance, only for utility. If a concept might save a ship or intercept a submarine, it was considered worthy of examination. Thus, techniques to counter material-based concealment such as adjusting frequency ranges or monitoring patterns of intermittent return were developed without the formality of full doctrinal overhaul. British leadership recognized that technological warfare did not always announce itself through grand breakthroughs. It could emerge through incremental changes, a modified mast profile, a tuned aerial, a recalibrated pulse. Authority did not dictate innovation but enabled it, through quiet support and provision. It was this steady endorsement rather than inspirational command that allowed British engineers to confront and outpace adversary developments. They were not asked to deliver extraordinary inventions, only to refine what already worked. The crazy oil trick, when it emerged, was thus countered by method rather than miracle, a reflection of leadership grounded in trust for expertise. Though warfare at sea was primarily technical, it retained a human and moral dimension. Concealment materials and radar interference were not merely tactical devices. They represented a contest over vulnerability and advantage. Each innovation granting invisibility translated into greater risk for merchant crews, many of whom were civilian volunteers. Ships carried fuel, grain, and essential supplies. If one disappeared without warning, it was not only a strategic failure but a human loss. British engineers were acutely aware that their work supported survival. They rarely saw the results firsthand, yet correspondence with operational units occasionally conveyed gratitude. Battle reports referred to improved early warning or effective tracing, not as destructive achievement, but as preservation of convoy integrity. In contrast, the enemy pursuit of concealment sought to enhance attack capability by exploiting absence. It became a struggle between protection and predation. Strategically, the British response prioritized resilience over confrontation. When faced with an adversary seeking to operate unseen, the Royal Navy chose not to mirror the tactic but to expand detection capability. Rather than hide, it learned to observe more deeply. Thus, the conflict over radar visibility evolved into something broader. It demonstrated that in the midst of war, even the most technical battles were shaped by intent, whether to remain unseen or to ensure that nothing remained unseen for long. By the winter of 1944, the Atlantic campaign had shifted in favor of the Allies, yet the sea lanes remained dangerous. U-boats equipped with snorkels were harder to track, and their commanders, acting under new directives, sought to exploit every environmental and technological weakness available. The Royal Navy's escort groups, hardened by years of experience, had become highly proficient in combined detection methods. Even so, unsettling incidents began to accumulate. Reports of radar contacts that dissolved into the sea without any corresponding sighting or sonar trace. The pattern emerged subtly. In rough weather, when surface clutter was naturally high, a small peak on the radar display might signal a U-boat snorkel or periscope. Operators recognizing the telltale signature would pass the bearing and range to the bridge. The escort would adjust course. Depth charges would be prepared. For a brief period, the return would stabilize. And then, as the ship approached to within operational distance, the peak would diminish. Not gradually, but abruptly, as though the object itself had lost substance. Initially, The Admiralty attributed this to wave interference. Heavy seas, especially at certain wavelengths, could mask or distort small targets, but repeated incidents under differing conditions challenged that explanation. Some reports noted that the contact vanished even in comparatively calm weather. Others recorded a secondary, weaker return several degrees off bearing, suggesting that the radar energy had been scattered rather than absorbed entirely. The turning point arrived when one escort group, operating southwest of Ireland, encountered a pattern sufficiently consistent to be flagged for investigation. Over the course of a single patrol, the group experienced 3 such fading contacts. Each occurred at a similar range. Each displayed a near-identical echo strength before diminishing, and each was lost at the moment when the ship closed distance. What distinguished this patrol was not the anomaly itself, but the meticulous record-keeping. The group's senior officer instructed radar operators to log settings with unusual precision: gain levels, pulse repetition frequency, sea state, bearing drift, and degree of operator adjustment. The data, transmitted by encrypted wireless to shore facilities, allowed analysts to correlate field conditions with equipment performance. When examined at the Admiralty signal establishment, the logs revealed that the echo strength began to reduce at the exact point where centimetric radar typically achieved peak clarity. In other words, the disappearance did not correspond to environmental noise. It coincided with a moment when detection should have been most reliable. This contradiction demanded explanation. Engineers suspected one of 2 possibilities. Either the U-boat had submerged abruptly at shallow depths, or some physical modification was interfering with radar return. Intelligence officers, monitoring reports from Allied air patrols, noted similar anomalies. Aircraft fitted with ASV radar had recorded faint or incomplete traces during anti-submarine sweeps, particularly when targeting snorkels. The pattern was consistent across several theaters. The matter gained urgency when fragments of a snorkel mast recovered from a damaged U-boat were delivered to a coastal analysis facility. The surface was coated in a thick, blackened substance. At first glance, it resembled a maintenance preservative, intended to protect exposed metal from corrosion. But when small samples were subjected to radar testing, the results were unmistakable. The coating reduced the reflectivity of the metal beneath. It did not eliminate detection, but it weakened the return sufficiently to obscure the target under marginal conditions. British engineers recognized the significance immediately. The enemy had attempted to create a crude form of radar-absorbing material, what would later be understood as an early variant of stealth coating. Its effectiveness depended on wavelength, angle of exposure, and environmental factors, but for certain centimetric radar sets, the reduction in return strength was enough to cause momentary disappearance on the screen. With this discovery, the earlier operational reports acquired new meaning. What operators had interpreted as equipment failure or environmental interference was, in fact, deliberate enemy adaptation. The radar screens had not lied. They had been challenged. The Admiralty responded quickly. A series of controlled trials was ordered using coated and uncoated metal plates mounted on rotating rigs along the coast. Radar sets identical to those aboard escorts and aircraft were calibrated to identical settings. The results confirmed operational experience. At certain bearings, and particularly when the coated surface was angled slightly away from the transmitter, the return weakened dramatically. When combined with sea clutter, the echo could be lost entirely. This marked the beginning of a broader tactical shift. British engineers, rather than seeking to counter the coating directly, focused on improving resilience of detection. They experimented with small frequency variations to identify the point at which return strength increased. They analyzed waveform behavior to determine whether modified pulse patterns produced more stable echoes, and they refined operator guidance to ensure that intermittent or incomplete returns were not dismissed as false positives. The climax of this period lay not in a single dramatic breakthrough, but in the realization that the war at sea had entered a new phase. Detection was no longer a binary matter of presence or absence. It had become a contest of degrees, where even a coating a few millimeters thick could tip the balance momentarily. The Royal Navy now understood what it faced: a hidden adversary employing hidden methods, and the quiet determination of British engineers would determine how that challenge was met. The discovery of radar-absorbing coatings altered the priorities of Britain's maritime scientific establishment almost overnight. What had been treated as a puzzling anomaly now demanded precise technical countermeasures. Engineers understood that the enemy's adaptation could not be allowed to create a gap in the surveillance chain. If a snorkel could disappear, even briefly, a submarine could reposition itself for attack. In the crowded and vulnerable waters of the western approaches, such a momentary lapse could mean a torpedo striking a merchant hull. The Admiralty convened a working group drawn from the ASE, TRE, and the Anti-Submarine Warfare ASW Division. Their task was not to create a new technology, but to strengthen the reliability of existing detection methods. The first step was to analyze signal variance. Centimetric radar relied on high-frequency pulses that could resolve small objects with impressive clarity. but this clarity was influenced by the pulse shape, repetition, frequency, and sensitivity of receiver circuitry. If the enemy coating interfered with one of those interactions, then subtle adjustments might compensate. Trials conducted on the South Coast demonstrated that small shifts in operating frequencies, only a matter of megahertz, altered the detectability of coated surfaces. At certain frequencies, the coating's absorptive properties weakened, producing clearer returns. Engineers concluded that operational flexibility was essential, rather than rely on a single optimal setting. Radar operators were trained to cycle through calibrated alternatives. This did not guarantee detection, but it ensured that the enemy's attempt to exploit a narrow weakness would not create a systemic blind spot. Meanwhile, escort groups applied lessons learned from laboratory tests. When contact faded, they no longer assumed Instead, they held course, maintained scanning discipline, and cross-checked with sonar. A momentary loss was treated as a change in signature rather than a disappearance. This shift in perception proved critical. It preserved the initiative. Commanders acted on the principle that concealment did not equate to escape or Coastal Command played an equally decisive role. Aircraft fitted with ASV radar were instructed to conduct overlapping sweeps, varying altitude and angle of exposure. Pilots and radar operators, accustomed to rapid engagements, now monitored weaker echoes, tracking them through intermittent phases. These aircraft acted as extensions of the escort screen, searching for traces that the surface vessels might miss. In one notable episode in early 1945, a Sunderland flying boat detected a faint, inconsistent return approximately 70 miles northwest of Land's End. The operator, trained under the revised procedures, resisted the instinct to dismiss it. Instead, he marked the bearing and tracked the fluctuations. The aircraft descended to reduce sea clutter interference, and the return strengthened marginally, just enough to justify an attack run. Depth charges were released across the calculated path. Hours later, an escort group recovered debris, including fragments of a snorkel mast coated in the same blackened substance previously analyzed onshore. The incident validated the new approach. Weaker echoes were no longer anomalies, but signals requiring interpretation. The Admiralty's confidence grew. Engineers refined display units to enhance micro-movement awareness. They adjusted the persistence of the radar trace, neither too long, which encouraged misinterpretation, nor too brief, which concealed intermittent returns. Operators reported that the revised settings gave them a steadier picture in which subtle variations were easier to follow. The enhancements did not eliminate concealment, but they reduced its tactical advantage. The combined effect of these measures, frequency agility, multi-sensor integration, and refined operator training, began to tell. Reports of disappearing contacts diminished. Escorts regained the ability to hold fleeting traces long enough to direct attacks. Aircraft learned to exploit angles where the coating's effect was weakest. Intelligence units, correlating operational outcomes with laboratory data, concluded that the enemy advantage had plateaued. In some cases, it had reversed. The snorkel itself, while less visible to radar, introduced acoustic and hydrodynamic vulnerabilities that sonar could exploit. A pivotal moment came during convoy operations off the northwest coast of Scotland. A Black Swan-class sloop detected a faint contact showing the unmistakable pattern of a snorkel. The return flickered, weakened, and for a moment nearly vanished. But the operator, using calibrated alternate frequencies, regained the trace. The commander ordered an attack. Depth charges were dropped in a controlled pattern. Minutes later, oil and wreckage surfaced. The success demonstrated that British countermeasures had surpassed the effectiveness of the enemy's adaptation. The episode also confirmed a broader truth. Concealment was a temporary advantage. Detection, by contrast, was a cumulative capability strengthened through disciplined observation, shared intelligence, and coordinated action. The German coding, once perceived as an alarming innovation, now appeared as a narrow technical expedient. British engineering and perseverance had rendered it insufficient. By the beginning of spring 1945, the pattern was clear. U-boats equipped with snorkels continued to pose danger, but their attempts at radar evasion no longer produced operational surprise. Escorts reported fewer unexplained disappearances. Radar traces, though occasionally weak, were seldom lost. The Royal Navy's confidence in combined detection was restored. Thus, the climax of this technological contest did not consist of a dramatic unveiling or a singular breakthrough. It emerged instead from methodical refinement, the steady accumulation of knowledge, the quiet correction of weaknesses, and the sustained commitment to ensuring that no adversary, however concealed, that could dictate the terms of engagement. Britain had reclaimed the initiative. The enemy's vanishing act had been understood, countered, and ultimately overtaken. By the early months of 1945, the cumulative effect of Allied detection measures had begun to reshape the final phase of the Battle of the Atlantic. Although enemy submarines persisted in their efforts to exploit the snorkel and its absorptive coating, the strategic balance had shifted decisively. What had initially appeared to be a dangerous innovation gradually revealed itself as a limited adaptation, one that British engineering, tactical integration, and operational discipline had already outpaced. The most immediate evidence of this shift came from convoy movement reports. During the first half of 1944, Allied merchant losses, though reduced from earlier peaks, still reflected the enduring threat of U-boats able to approach under cover of darkness or low visibility. By contrast, the closing months of that year showed a marked reduction in successful attacks. Escorts now interpreted intermittent radar returns not as equipment faults but as signs of concealed presence, prompting early defensive maneuvers. Merchant ships benefited indirectly. Fewer torpedoes were launched at convoy formations simply because submarines were exposed earlier and forced to disengage RAF. Coastal Command's operational summaries reinforced this trend. Squadrons flying long-range patrols over the western approaches, Biscay routes and northern transit corridors recorded a higher incidence of disrupted submarine movements. Aircraft which might previously have abandoned faint radar traces now pursued them across repeated passes, adjusting altitude or angle of approach. On several occasions, aircrews reported that a weak contact grew clearer once the aircraft descended. To reduce sea clutterer behavior entirely, consistent with what British laboratories had demonstrated regarding coding performance at certain wavelengths. Such operational gains were matched by analytical clarity. As more damaged or captured equipment reached coastal examination stations, scientists were able to assemble a fuller picture of the enemy's radar defeating attempts. Tests showed that the absorptive properties of the coating varied significantly with thickness, uniformity, and exposure to saltwater. The harsh environment of the Atlantic degraded the material rapidly. A coating that performed moderately well in controlled trials lost effectiveness after prolonged use, particularly when subjected to repeated surface contact with waves or ice. More importantly, the material's strengths existed within a narrow band of frequencies. When British radar operators cycled to alternative calibrated settings, the coating's benefit diminished. Engineers concluded that its utility lay not in broad concealment but in momentary reduction, a brief weakening of echo strength that might buy the submarine precious minutes. Against an unprepared opponent, such minutes could matter. Against coordinated Allied detection, they were increasingly insufficient. Escort commanders recognized this intuitively. Their after-action reports began to reflect a change in mindset. Instead of describing encounters in terms of presence or absence, they referred to variation in echo stability, momentary attenuation, or trace reappearance following adjustment. This shift in vocabulary mirrored the evolving tactical approach. Detection had become a matter of perseverance rather than sudden revelation. Strategically, the German advantage waned further as Allied air superiority increased. In previous years, U-boats could travel on the surface to reposition, conserving battery power and achieving higher speed. By 1945, the omnipresence of patrol aircraft forced them to remain submerged almost continuously. The snorkel, which had promised greater endurance, imposed strict constraints. Submarines moved slowly, suffered from limited visibility, and exposed themselves repeatedly through mechanical noise and hydraulic disturbances detectable by sonar. The enemy's absorptive coating thus sat at the intersection of two competing needs: the need to avoid radar and the need to maintain operational mobility. Each benefit incurred a cost, and as British detection methods matured, the balance tipped inexorably toward exposure. The broader sense within the Admiralty was one of measured reassurance, not triumphant, while men were still at risk, but confidence. The technological contest had been confronted with patience and answered with discipline. The feared vanishing act of the U-boat snorkel was no longer a mystery. It had been reduced to a manageable variable within an increasingly robust detection framework. Thus, by April 1945, when Germany's submarine arm began to collapse through a combination of shortages, losses, and command breakdown, Britain knew that its response to concealment had mattered. The Atlantic remained open, the convoys continued to sail, and the quiet work of British engineers had ensured that the attempt to disappear from radar did not alter the outcome of the war at sea. In the months following Germany's surrender in May 1945, British analysts turned their attention from wartime urgency to appraisal and documentation. The Admiralty gathered reports detailing incidents of reduced radar returns and correlated them with recovered materials. Technical officers compiled evaluations, noting both the limited effectiveness of the enemy's absorptive coatings and the success of Allied adaptations. These documents, circulated under restricted security classification, formed part of a wider effort to extract lessons from the conflict. Attention then shifted to the future. While the war at sea had concluded, radar technology had not. The insights gained during the contest over concealment shaped early Cold War research into electronic warfare and radar resilience. Initial experiments with surface treatments or oil-like compounds were superseded by targeted investigations into structured composites and refined coatings capable of absorbing or dispersing electromagnetic energy. Industrial partners, many of whom had produced radar units during the war, were quietly tasked with exploring advanced materials with stable performance across broader wavelength ranges. The Royal Aircraft Establishment and the Admiralty's experimental units collaborated to assess how such concepts might apply not Only 2 ships but 2 airframes. Aware that aircraft speeds and operating altitudes were increasing, planners considered whether future adversaries might attempt similar techniques to reduce visibility to airborne radar. The emphasis was not on replicating the enemy's efforts but on anticipating them. Britain's approach remained grounded in resilience, rather than aiming to become invisible. Development focused on ensuring that British detection equipment could not easily be deceived. The post-war creation of organizations, such as the Defense Research Policy Committee, allowed for knowledge transfer between services. Reports on enemy radar-absorbing materials circulated among select technical branches. Naval architects, designing the next generation of surface vessels, were encouraged to consider signature reduction alongside armor, propulsion, and armament. Air Ministry documents referenced the possibility that radar avoidance techniques might one day be employed more systematically, particularly by high-performance aircraft. Throughout these deliberations, one characteristic endured: the British preference for measured, evidence-based progression. There was no rush toward radical redesign. The experience of war had demonstrated that incremental refinement, when applied consistently, could neutralize ambitious adversary initiatives. The crazy oil trick, as some operators had informally referred to it, was treated in analysis not as an oddity but as a reminder that even modest alterations could influence operational outcomes. Lessons extended beyond the technical. Senior personnel recognized that effective countermeasures had emerged from the unglamorous persistence of radar operators, engineers, and intelligence officers. A culture of careful observation had often outmatched attempts at concealment. This influenced post-war training ethos. New recruits, particularly in signals and surveillance disciplines, were instructed to value consistency over spectacle and interpretation over assumption. The Admiralty's final assessment of the episode was characteristically restrained. It concluded that enemy use of radar-reducing coatings produced measurable interference under certain conditions, but noted that counteractive measures proved adequate. The language was cautious, but the implication was clear. British engineering had met the threat precisely, without excess, and in time to prevent strategic disruption. In a conflict where so many outcomes hinged on timing, this was no small achievement. In the broader historical arc, the events of 1944-45 marked an early entry into what would later become known as signature management and electronic countersurveillance. Though not conceptualized in such terms at the time, the principle had emerged. Visibility in warfare is not fixed, and can be shaped deliberately. Future generations of scientists and officers would build upon that understanding. But in 1945, as Britain stepped from war into recovery, the legacy remained quiet. No ceremonies marked the radar operators who tracked fading traces or the engineers who sat over oscilloscope readings in converted schoolrooms. Their contribution was not symbolized by victory parades or medals. It existed instead in an unbroken shipping route, a convoy arriving intact, and a war concluded with the Atlantic secure. And in that enduring maritime corridor, the lifeline of an island nation lay, the true measure of what had been achieved in the long history of maritime warfare. Victories are often measured in ships sunk or battles won. Yet, during the harsh final winter of the Atlantic campaign, one of Britain's most significant triumphs remained almost undetectable, felt not in decisive action, but in what did not occur. No convoy was lost because a submarine remained unseen. No escort failed because its radar could not be trusted. Instead, the war at sea ended as it had largely been fought, through attrition, persistence, and the accumulated work of those whose names seldom entered dispatches. Engineers in temporary laboratories, radar operators leaning into dim-lit screens, analysts comparing signals on paper worn thin through repeated handling. They ensured that disappearance did not become defeat. The so-called crazy oil trick, for all its ingenuity, revealed something fundamental about the nature of conflict in the 20th century. The battlefield was no longer defined solely by steel, fire, and distance. Increasingly, it lay within the realm of science. Electrons traveling across air, frequencies tuned for clarity, materials chosen for their interaction with energy rather than durability alone. And in that realm, advantage belonged not to the boldest gesture, but to the most sustained refinement. Britain answered innovation not with spectacle, but with steadfastness. There was no rush toward countercoating or an attempt to mirror the technique. Instead, detection widened its gaze. The systems complemented one another. Knowledge traveled faster than adaptation. The sea, once an expanse of uncertainty, became a domain increasingly shaped by measurement and understanding. When the war closed, nothing in the Atlantic was truly invisible. Difficult to perceive, perhaps, hard to hold on the screen, but never beyond reach. And therein lies the quiet lesson. In the hands of people committed to precision and perseverance, even the smallest signal flickering briefly on a cold radar display can be enough to hold the line.